Thank you everyone so much for making the time to be here today and join us for the New England Law Review's first ever virtual fall symposium featuring a discussion with attorney Alec Karakatsanis, the founder of Civil Rights Corps in DC. So to introduce myself, my name is Bree Monero, and I am the editor-in-chief of this year's journal. A bit about the New England Law Review. We have published a journal of cutting edge legal scholarship. We publish both professional and student authors and have been doing so since 1965. Over the years, we have been cited in statutes, federal regulations, cases, and books, as well as other law reviews and journals. Our membership consists of talented, passionate, and driven students who are excited to be working at the forefront of legal questions challenging the country. I'd like to take just a moment to thank my e-board for all of the effort and energy they have devoted to our journal this year. To Bettina Pancho, our executive online editor, Julia Pamela, our managing editor, and Maya Thomas, our business managing editor. When the four of us were selected for these roles, we could not have possibly imagined all of the challenges we'd be facing this year. But you three have shown a willingness to step in and step up in ways that have truly humbled me, and I could not be more grateful for the emphasis on mutual support and collaboration amongst the e-board. I would also like to thank our entire editorial staff. You have all been up against incredible challenges this year, but you've taken them in stride. While we certainly are all struggling with adjusting to a largely virtual world, we also recognize that each of our members are individuals, much like everyone in attendance today, and as a result, are facing their own unique burdens and challenges as a result of an ongoing global pandemic, increasing economic hardship, and a national uprising against racism and police brutality. It has not been easy, but you have continued to show up and devote your time and your energy to the success of our journal in ways we never expected. Thank you. Finally, to our associates who had to dive into the intimidating world of law review during a time of constant reconfiguration and adapting to new challenges. Thank you for your patience, your flexibility, and your understanding. It has not been easy, but we are so grateful to all of you for rising to the occasion. Our associates have just completed their first major writing assignments, where they applied their growing research and writing skills to case comments, which evaluate and critique recent cases from all across the state and throughout the First Circuit. We promise we're getting those evaluations back to you all soon. Finally, to our academic advisor, Professor Friedman, thank you for your constant encouragement, your guidance, and your understanding. And thank you for being just intimidating enough to keep us all on our toes. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge everyone sharing this space with us today. I would love if everyone could quickly utilize the chat function, which we will be placing on pause for the duration of the conversation. But it would be great if everyone could just use the chat function to pop in where you're tuning in from, whether it's your city, your state, your law school, your college, your organization, your firm. It would be great to just get a feel for who is in the room today. All over Massachusetts, Syracuse law. Oh, it's going so very fast. Georgia, Rhode Island, New Jersey, California, Ohio. This is incredible. Wow. Thank you all for being here and being part of this conversation. This is really wonderful. So before we get started, I would like to also acknowledge that the topic of today's discussion, envisioning a radical transformation to our current criminal injustice system, will take more than just lawyers to become a reality. It takes a movement. It takes shared knowledge, mutual trust, and collective growth. It is for this exact reason that it's important for us as lawyers and future lawyers to recognize others in our community who are doing this kind of work. As such, I'd like to quickly mention a few local organizations who are deeply invested in envisioning a safer and more equitable world and have been on the ground every day trying to make that happen. Families for Justice as Healing, Building Up People, Not Prisons, Deeper Than Water, the Emancipation Initiative, the Massachusetts Bail Fund, New Beginnings Reentry Services, Sisters Unchained, and the Young Abolitionists. I would also like to welcome Professor Lauren Goulden from Syracuse Law, who is not only contributing a response piece to the arguments set forth in Usual Cruelty for our forthcoming publication, but has joined us for today's conversation along with all of the students in her criminal justice reform seminar. So welcome. Thank you for being here with us. Now, before I pass the proverbial mic to our guest, attorney Alec Karakatsanis, I would like to take a few minutes for a proper introduction. Alec graduated from Yale College in 2005 with a degree in ethics, politics, and economics, and graduated from Harvard Law School in 2008, where he was a Supreme Court chair of the Harvard Law Review. We've heard of that journal. Before founding Civil Rights Corps, Alec was a civil rights lawyer and public defender with the Special Litigation Division of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, a federal public defender in Alabama representing impoverished people accused of federal crimes, and a co-founder of the nonprofit organization Equal Justice Under the Law. Alec was awarded the 2016 Trial Lawyer of the Year by Public Justice for his role in bringing constitutional civil rights cases to challenge the American money bail system, as well as the 2016 Stephen B. Bright Award for contributions to indigent defense in the South by Gideon's Promise. Alec's work at the Civil Rights Corps challenging the money bail system in California was recently honored with the 2018 Champion of Public Defense Award by the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. Alec is interested in ending human caging, surveillance, the death penalty, immigration laws, war, and inequality. He also likes playing the piano, soccer, and making weird paintings. Most recently, he is the author of this book, Usual Cruelty, The Complicity of Lawyers in the Criminal Injustice System, which we are gathered to discuss today. Throughout a series of 3 powerful essays, attorney Karakatsanis uses his book to explore the criminal injustice system, the vulnerabilities of reformist movements, and the brutalities inflicted on Americans every day by a fundamentally unjust punishment bureaucracy. As a radical lawyer successfully challenging the inequities plaguing the criminal justice landscape, Alec urges law students, those of us just beginning to come to grips with our own power to affect other people's lives, to evaluate our own complicity in a system of injustice, and to strive to become more human lawyers. Attorney Karakatsanis, thank you so much for your time, for your energy, for your work and your passion. And thank you for your willingness to be here and share that with us today.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you, Bree, for organizing this amazing event and for that wonderful introduction, and to the whole New England Law Review for this incredible honor of not only giving me the chance to talk to you a little bit about the ideas that are in the book, but also for having a whole discussion both here and in writing about the ideas in the book. I'm really looking forward to seeing how the whole issue turns out, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing you all talk to me today about the reactions you had to the book, the questions, the thoughts that it provoked and whatnot. And so I'm going to try not to speak for maybe as long as you had me budgeted for, and really get to the part of this where we can have a discussion together. I think if your law school is anything like my law school, you're constantly bombarded with people speaking at you, and there isn't enough space for really genuine conversation. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just start by giving a little bit about my background and some of the things that I've seen, so you can understand where I'm coming from, so you can appreciate maybe some of the biases and personal experiences that I bring to some of the ideas that I write about, because we're all subject to our own personal experiences, and then you can maybe appreciate some of the blind spots that I have perhaps in some of the ways that I think and talk about these issues. And then I would love to hear from you all. I know you all, from what I understand, have a number of questions that are planned. So let's just dig right in. I opened the first essay in the book with the story of Charnell Mitchell. And the reason I did that is I think what happened with Charnell really, in a lot of ways, set the course of my career over the last 5 or 6 years. I had just quit my job as a public defender, and I'd gotten a grant from my law school to start an organization. I had really no idea what I was doing, and no idea certainly how to run an organization or even how to bring civil cases, really. And the first thing I did with a little bit of money that I got was I bought a plane ticket to Birmingham. I used to started my career as a public defender in Alabama, and I rented a car and I just drove around the state, ultimately making my way to Montgomery. And the things that I saw on that trip really affected me very powerfully. I would sit in the back of courtrooms with a hooded sweatshirt on and just take notes. And then I would interview people's families as they left the courtroom. Then I would go to the jails and interview people in jail. And when I got to Montgomery, several mornings after I started doing this around the state, before visiting some of my old friends at the public defender's office, I decided to go to the local municipal court. And that morning, I saw 67 people chained together in jail garb in the local courtroom. All of them were Black. And as I watched a little bit longer, not one of them was accused of a crime. They were all there because they owed the city of Montgomery debt. And one by one, I watched as they came in front of the judge and begged to go back to their families. And one by one, I saw the judge scream at them and tell them that if they didn't pay, they were going to go to jail. And since you're recording this event, I won't go into all of the details, but I was removed from the courtroom, and after I was removed from the courtroom for, I guess, making objections when if you're not a member of the Alabama bar, you can't make objections from the back of the audience. I guess is the rule they were trying to enforce. But I went next door to the local jail, which, as I often say, in Montgomery, as it is in many other places around the country, is both metaphorically and physically connected to the local courthouse. And I just started calling out the names of the people whose cases I had seen. And the first person I called out was Charnell Mitchell. And when I saw Charnell, she described to me that she had been sitting with her 1-year-old on her lap and her 4-year-old next to her watching TV on a Sunday night. And the police raided her home, not unlike what we've seen recently with Breonna Taylor. And the police took her babies away and handcuffed her and put chains on her and brought her down to the jail and told her that she owed unpaid debt from traffic tickets from 4 years previously. And by the time I saw Charnell, she'd been given a court document that said, pay us $2,807 or do 59 days in jail. And Charnell explained to me in Montgomery that if you owed debt, you could sit out your debt at $50 a day if you couldn't pay it. And she also explained that if you agreed to be a janitor for the city and to clean the feces and the blood and the mucus and the mold and the urine from the floors where you were sleeping on top of other people and the bathrooms for the judges and the jail walls, you could get an extra $25 a day, $75 a day, right, total. And so Charnell turned over her court document, and in a pencil she'd been given from one of the guards was writing the days, 50, 50, 75, 75, and then subtracting those amounts she earned each day from the total amount of her debt, desperately trying to figure out when she could get home because she had no idea where her babies were. She was too poor to pay the for-profit telecom company contract, call anyone from the jail. And so she had no idea where her children were. And I want you to imagine what that was like. And I met 5 people that day, and they became my first 5 clients as a civil rights lawyer. And we filed a class action lawsuit against the city of Montgomery. And within a few weeks, we had a hearing, and the federal judge was so outraged at what had been going on that he ordered all of the top city officials to appear in front of him in person, explain how this could be, that people were being caged just because they couldn't make a monetary payment. Instead of appearing in front of the federal judge, the city did something extraordinary. They released everybody from the jail on a single day. That was a really powerful moment because it really highlighted something that I had sort of known intellectually. We have no reason for this system of mass human caging. It's not serving any interests. At least it's not serving the interests that it tells us it's serving. Things like public safety and well-being and creating communities that can flourish. So much so that without a care in the world, a major city can just release everybody from its jail in a single day. And after that case, I started seeing a lot of reports in the news media about this kind of thing happening elsewhere. And in fact, Michael Brown had just been murdered in Ferguson. And I read an article about some of the same court debt problems going on in Ferguson. And so I called up the person who had written the article and I asked if I could move into their house. And for some reason they let me. And so I flew to St. Louis and started living out of this nonprofit lawyer's house, Thomas Harvey, who had started Arch City Defenders. And what I discovered when I got to Ferguson, and I started embedding myself with the people that were protesting every night and started doing these town hall meetings in people's living rooms where people would invite their sisters and their cousins and their brothers and their mothers and their grandmothers and their neighbors. We'd have these incredible gatherings in people's homes in Ferguson and all the towns around it. I learned that Ferguson averaged 3.6 arrest warrants per household, almost all of which for unpaid debt. In my 5 years since, and we're still litigating this case that we brought against Ferguson, I still have not found one of these outstanding warrants for a white person. And so after a long time, I was hearing story after story, just like Charnell Mitchell, just devastating stories of people being separated from their children, people being brutalized in a cage with no sunlight and no fresh air and no water. Ferguson didn't give people soap or toothbrushes or exercise or any of the things that we all take for granted in our lives. And so we brought a case against Ferguson. As we were having success in these cases, we brought similar cases against the debtors' prisons in Mississippi and Louisiana and Tennessee. Something occurred to me, which is that the same legal flaw, that no human being should be put in a cage because she can't make a payment, is really the core of the American money bail system. And so we spent many, many months redesigning our legal arguments so that we could challenge the pretrial money bail system as opposed to the post-trial fines and fees system. And one of the theories behind these cases was, in addition to working with people who are directly impacted, identifying local movements and campaigns and organizers who were really trying to tell a very different story about what the purposes of the criminal punishment bureaucracy are. In addition to all of that, we were telling a story about the legal system that was rather subversive. It was asking the question, if the legal system is deciding who is separated from their children and who is in a cage where they're likely to be exposed to infectious disease and sexual assault and physical beatings and lack of access to clean food and air and water, if we're making that decision on the basis of how much access to cash a person has, how can we trust anything else the criminal punishment bureaucracy is doing? If the system is willing to make this important of a decision with these consequences, right? We all saw the death of Sandra Bland. We all saw the death of Khalif Browder. If the system is willing to make this kind of decision for this kind of reason, how can we trust anything that it's doing? And so I think in a way, the money bail cases that we began were an attempt to radically challenge some of the underlying narratives and some of the integrity that the criminal punishment bureaucracy demands for its own legitimacy. And so on January 15th, 2015, I had prepared all of the legal filings in advance, and I drove to a small town in Alabama called Clanton, and I walked into the police station and I asked them for a list of everyone they'd arrested in the last few days, and for reasons I don't understand, they just gave me the list. And then I walked over to the county jail and I started calling out names from the list. And that's when I met Christy Dawn Varden. And I dedicated the book to Christy and to 3 of my other clients who passed away during the cases. All 4 women were people of incredible courage and with incredible moral compasses. And our work and my life certainly was incredibly enriched in even the relatively brief time that we got to work so closely together. And I met Christy the morning after, or 2 mornings after, actually, she had been arrested for shoplifting from a Walmart. And because she couldn't afford a couple $100s, she'd been separated from her 2 children. And when I met her in the jail, she was distraught. She didn't know where her kids were. She was scared. She was cold. She told me that she was so distressed and was asking where her children were, but couldn't afford phone calls to find them, that she kept screaming and crying. And the jail got frustrated with her. And so they took her out of her cell. They took her to a little hallway where there's no security cameras. And they strapped her into a chair that they keep in that hallway. And they started tasing her body over and over and over again. And she asked me to take photographs of these taser wounds. And so I did. And that morning, despite what had just happened to her, despite being in an incredibly vulnerable position, she said to me that she wanted to do whatever it takes to make sure that this kind of thing never happens to another woman again. And with that, she became the first person since the rise of mass incarceration to challenge on equal protection and due process grounds the American money bail system. Let me just move a little bit so I'm not in the sun. And so after I met Christy and we had this long conversation, I sped down the highway and rushed to the federal court, got the case on file, and filed this first challenge on equal protection and due process. And at the time, it was seen as a pretty radical challenge. I mean, I had been at the Department of Injustice for a meeting a couple of months prior to that, and I mentioned to them that we were going to start challenging the American money bail system. And they said to me, well, we use the money bail system in over 3,000 jurisdictions all over the country. That's just normal. It's what we do. And I said, that's exactly why it's important that we challenge it. I didn't expect to win any of these cases, but part of the goal was to tell a very different story about what our legal system is and why it does the things that it does. But lo and behold, through a tremendous amount of work and pressure with journalists and with community activists and just being very persistent with meeting with the DOJ very frequently, within 6 weeks of us filing that case, they actually filed a statement of interest in our case, agreeing with all of our arguments. And so it was no longer the radical position of a small DC nonprofit run out of someone's bedroom. It was now the official position of the United States government. And so in the first 10 months of 2015, we brought 12 of these class action lawsuits in 12 different cities around the country. The goal both to show that it could be done and also to convey a sense of urgency about the way the money bail system was functioning. And so over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been working on this issue all over the country, from cases striking down the money bail system as it operates in California and Nevada. Obviously, the case that may have gotten the most attention is our challenge to the money bail system in Harris County, Texas. And so I think about Christy a lot. Christy didn't even live to see our case settled and the city of Clanton eliminate its use of secured money bail. She died about 6 weeks after we brought the case on her behalf through causes related to her extreme poverty and lack of access to medical care. And all of the other things that our society is either neglecting because we're focused so much on what we call crime, or things that the criminal punishment bureaucracy is actually exacerbating, like the distribution of wealth in this country. And so, all of that work initially, and much of the other work I can talk about if people are interested, are, for example, our work against police search warrants and our work against the militarization of police generally. All of this work is really designed to identify and attack the core pillars of the American punishment bureaucracy, which is, in my opinion, white supremacy, history, sort of unbroken line from chattel slavery to the new Jim Crow, to the sort of system of organized racial terror, and to what we have now in the criminal punishment bureaucracy, and the use of the punishment bureaucracy and all of its various tools to preserve the wealth of people who own things in our society, and to exploit people who don't own things in service of making the people who own things able to own more things. And I think that's really what the criminal punishment system has always been about. One of the central challenges for us then is, how do we counter the extraordinary propaganda that this system is able to generate from a variety of different sources, all designed to make us think that it is serving certain interests, like it is serving the interests of public safety, or it is helping create a world consistent with our values. For example, the Supreme Court even has etched upon its facade the words equal justice under law. But if you think about the US Supreme Court, it's never been an institution that has done anything at the vanguard of equality. I mean, this is an institution that called indigenous people savages and not only signed off on, but cheered the extermination and genocide of those people and the theft of their land. And that said that Black people were property. And that said that women don't deserve rights. And for its entire history, it's been a reflection of the existing power structure. And by that, I mean the existing white, wealthy power structure. And I think one of the things that I urge in the book, after outlining in I hope enough detail of how this power structure works and why we can't put any faith in these institutions on their own to be at the vanguard of social justice. It's very important to understand and think about, given that understanding of how it works, what is the role of a lawyer in navigating that system and in trying in some small way to promote a world of more justice? And beyond that, what is the role of a student? What is the role of an ordinary human being? I don't think lawyers, and this is something that law schools go to great lengths to beat out of you, but I don't think lawyers have any kind of special access to justice, any kind of special knowledge about what a just world or a just legal system or a just community should look like. And in fact, it's really the people who are targeted by our legal systems, our systems of extraction, that probably have much more access to basic conceptions of what they need to flourish in their own lives and in their own communities. So I could go in several different directions here, but I thought maybe, Bree, I would pause just for a moment before I ramble on any longer to just say that background is some of where I'm coming from. I'm a person who sees the United States caging Black people at a rate 6 times that of South Africa, and I say the problem is that it's not that we haven't brought enough lawsuits, and it's not that we have a few bad cops. These are deep historical, institutional, economic, political, and racial problems that lawyers need to understand as such, not as legal doctrinal problems. And with that sort of initial provocation, I'll just stop and see if you have any questions and you want to steer me in a direction that you and the editorial board and the other members of the review and other people listening would find most interesting. I'm happy to talk about anything that you think is interesting.
Thank you. There were a few things that we talked about on the journal that we thought would be interesting to hear about from your perspective. On two ends. So one is that New England law Boston, and I think along with Suffolk law, create a ton of the city's future prosecutors and public defenders. So I think certainly for those of us who have read your book and are familiar with sort of your work and your arguments, there's a fear about becoming another cog in a harmful machine. So I think it would be really interesting to hear your perspective, especially as someone who's worked in public defense, to sort of talk about how to escape that cycle. And we also talked a lot about, which I think probably goes to your arguments about being a more human lawyer, is sort of the very intentional language you use throughout your book, and even so far today as you've spoken. You know, we talk about the images that are conjured up in our minds when we hear words like jail or prison versus when we hear phrases like human caging, and when we hear criminal injustice system and a punishment bureaucracy. So we would also be really interested to hear sort of the reasoning for the language you choose, and you know, especially as people who are going to be using the language to try to, you know, to defend the rights of other people. How do we, you know, how should we be considering our language and thinking about language within the context and confines of the law, to not create any illusions about what we're really doing and what system we're sort of working in. And I know there are many people here besides our law review, so I just do want to mention that we will certainly open up the floor for everyone as well.
Those are two great questions. I'll take the second one first because it's easier. So I think that the way we talk and the way we use language mediates how we experience the world. The language we use is so important because it colors how we experience things in our minds. There's a reason that police reports are so are written in a very particular language of bureaucracy. They remove all of the details that make someone human. They remove all of the extraneous context, and they focus on a particular moment and a particular act by a particular person, by a particular point of view that is really devoid of any of the kinds of colors and sort of complexities that animate human life. There's a reason that police reports are very different from poems. And there's a reason that a bureaucracy, when it's trying to process and cage human beings, is going to treat people like numbers and places and actions rather than the sort of like really broad constellation of things that human beings actually are. And so I think that one example is played out over and over again throughout the system. Much of the language of the system is designed to desensitize us. It's designed to get us to be indifferent to and normalized to things that really should shock us to the core. So just by changing some of the language that we're using, we can get people to see a little bit differently something that they've been looking at right in the face for so long. And I want to just highlight, it's not just about words. It's not just about changing, jail to cage. It's about creating an atmosphere in which people are ready to absorb a really different way of thinking. And that sometimes means, as a lawyer, you have to create a context and an atmosphere within which words will be understood and heard. Let me give you an example. When I was a public defender, I was assigned to do all of what we called illegal reentry prosecutions in my district. Illegal reentry is a euphemism that federal government uses for trying to cage someone who's been born on the other side of an imaginary political boundary and who wanted to come to this side of that political boundary to make a better life for their families. We call that alien illegal reentry. We call them aliens, and we say illegal reentry rather than describing what they're actually doing and why they're actually doing it, right? So when I did these defenses, when I got there, the judges were giving astronomical sentences for people. These judges in Alabama had been bombarded with propaganda about so-called illegal immigrants. Alabama was actually passing all of these laws that criminalized renting a home to people who were born on the other side of an imaginary political boundary, or contracting with them, giving them a job, acting kindly to them in any number of variety of ways, giving them a ride in your car. They tried to make that illegal, right? This is the context within which these judges were living. And you can't help but be a creature of your environment. And so one of the things that we did at sentencing hearing was I would say, Your Honor, I'm asking you to order the United States Marshals to unshackle my client so that she can hug her daughter one last time before she is sentenced and deported. And all of a sudden, we're not talking about punishing an illegal alien, we're talking about separating a mother from her daughter. Or I would talk to the clients about the importance of making artwork, and they would make artwork inside the jail. And then at sentencing, they'd be describing their artwork to the judge. And it would be a conversation about, why did I make certain artistic choices? And here's why I showed my daughter like this. And here's how I wrote about I drew a picture of my local congregation and my job. And here's a particular flower that I love. And here's why it makes me think of where I'm from. And all of these things, we're talking about artistic choices of a human being now, rather than punishing someone for endangering, in this sort of very like amorphous sense, the sort of the American identity, or whatever it is that these judges were thinking was the danger of people coming into this country for a better life. And one of my colleagues had this brilliant idea where for every sentencing hearing, she would write a long memo about the history of American intervention in that particular Latin American country. or that particular African country. And so these judges just had no idea, for example, that the reason that many of these people were coming to this country is because US military and US trained police had made life almost impossible where they were coming from. It had destabilized their societies and led to cycles of violence and poverty and misery, and that these were directly connected to the American government that was just now trying to cage them again. And something amazing happened. It didn't happen right away, but over time, and of course we supplemented all of this with top-notch legal advocacy and made all of the right legal arguments, as well as of course lawyers learn how to do. But we started getting lower sentences across the board, lower and lower and lower, as we started to change the context within which judges were hearing the very same words, right? If I had come into that courtroom on the first day and just started throwing around the term human caging, it'd be very, very different than if you prepare someone and slowly expose them to something different. So the only addition I'd make to your great point about language, Bree, is that when we talk about language, it's not just about words, it's about an entire context within which people understand words. Because after all, the same word means something very different to me than it means to someone like Joe Biden or Donald Trump or people with very different life experiences. And so you often see, and this is another thing that I wrote about in the book, punishment bureaucrats who spent their entire careers engaging in human caging are now using some of the very same words that I use. And they mean and understand very different things by them. And I think it's a sign of progress that they're now even using those words. But that means that we now have to come up with different words and constantly be pushing people with new words that get them to really get them out of the assembly line bureaucratic mentality. Now, your broader question, I think, is really fascinating. How do we become agents within this bureaucracy without becoming what you called cogs in its machine? I want to preface my response by saying I don't pretend to have the answer to this question. It is a question that I struggle with still every single day, even though I'm not a public defender anymore. As a civil rights lawyer, I'm invoking the US legal system, the court system, to vindicate certain rights. And by doing that, I'm legitimating it, right? In some sense, I'm saying this is a tribunal that is capable of delivering justice. I think that's fraught with difficulty. And so the way that I sort of think about that is we're not bringing these cases to win them, and we're not trying to win them with any naive conception that winning a legal case is going to automatically erase an injustice any more than winning Brown versus Board of Education ended school segregation, right? 60 years later, schools are more segregated in much of the country after Brown. You have to understand a legal case as a very small piece of an effort to build power in a movement. And so the example I often give of that is the same-sex marriage movement. They brought all these cases in the early 80s. They lost in virtually every forum, and they lost in the US Supreme Court. And then 20, 25 years later, they started bringing some of these same cases. In fact, it was many of the same lawyers and some new lawyers bringing the same cases under the same 6 or 7 words in the 14th Amendment, and they won in most places, including winning in the US Supreme Court. And the question is, did the lawyers become smarter? Did they go to better law schools that taught them better doctrine? Were they making better, more sophisticated legal arguments? Or was there a social movement that changed the way we think about same-sex marriage? And so what we need to think about is how can lawyers, whether they're in a public defender's office or a DA's office, how can we be a small part? Because lawyers are not really the ones that should be leading this social movement. How can we be a part of a social movement that changes the way all of us think about human caging, that changes the way we all think about the purposes of the punishment bureaucracy? So I think there's different answers to your question, whether you're talking about DAs or public defenders. I'll just, talk about public defenders since I know a little bit more about that. I think it's very, very hard for line DAs to really to do this work. It's possible if you're the head DA, you can take some steps that dramatically reduce the size of the punishment bureaucracy's footprint. But I'm much more familiar with the public defender side of things, both because I was a public defender and because I do a lot of training for public defenders now. And I'm part of an effort right now to get public defenders to think of themselves as movement lawyers. And I think this can manifest in a number of ways. it's not just thinking about your individual clients, it's thinking about how you can connect your clients to each other, how your clients are connected to community organizing that's going on in their community, how your clients can, if they want to, again, within appropriate ethical constraints, tell their story. As public defenders, we have ceded control of the narrative of the punishment bureaucracy to police and prosecutors. When I was a public defender, we were barred from talking to the media. We were barred from telling our clients stories, from having our clients tell their stories. That has completely changed in the last 12 years. Now, public defenders' offices around the country are coordinating with campaigns to end the local jail, are coordinating with their clients and local organizers to tell their stories, to fight on policy campaigns, to organize people in their communities, to educate people, to provide various platforms for the clients to tell their stories. Our organization has an artist in residence and a poet in residence who are both formerly incarcerated people whose job is to get our lawyers to really think about how they can not only think about issues differently from a different perspective, with different language than lawyers are taught to have, but also how can they engage with other communities in different ways. And that's really exciting. And that kind of thing is happening in public defenders' offices around the country. They're thinking more systemically. One thing that I'm seeing a lot is, instead of thinking of your cases as just over and done with and then on to the next case, think about patterns. What patterns am I seeing across cases? What patterns are my colleagues seeing? How can my colleagues and I come together to collect these stories, whether it's stories of police abuse, jail misconduct, terrible bail examples, bad judge rulings, examples of infectious disease spreading in the jail, prosecutor misconduct. There are public defenders' offices around the country that have working groups for collecting these stories, and working groups of people in the community for how do we tell these stories. So I think it's going to involve a little bit of a change in how you orient yourself in terms of what you think your job is as a lawyer. Because I guarantee you, if you think of your job as just making the best legal arguments and fighting for your clients in court, we will lose this fight, because the courts are never designed and have never been a place where our clients are going to prevail. You may win a few cases here and there, but that's not what the courts are for. We need to dramatically change the balance of power in our communities, and we need to make the courts for something else. And so I think it's more of a mentality that public defenders need to have. The last thing I'll say, and I think this applies not just to the cogs in the wheel of public defenders and prosecutors, but to all students and to all people really in our society, we are constantly bombarded with propaganda. Law school is a 3-year propaganda course in a certain conception of what the law is and what the law has been. It doesn't tell you certain things, right? If you look at the media, the way that it talks about crime, right, and violent crime, without even asking the question, well, what is a crime? Who decides what a crime is? And who decides what violence is? Is violence taking some stuff from 7-Eleven? Or is violence exposing children to lead in their water? What is violence? Is violence a company fraudulently foreclosing on someone's home and then using the local sheriff to kick people out of their homes? Or is violence a person who's been illegally removed from their home, trying to find a safe place to shelter in the winter and breaking into a vacant house, right? So whether you think of burglary as violent or home foreclosure as violent is a really political question. And the media has certain things to say about that, because the media is typically interested in preserving the interests of people who own things, because those people also own the media. So I usually tell people really 4 main rules of thumb for preventing themselves from becoming a cog in the system, and for leading a life that can really put you in the right position, at least, to push back on many of the injustices in our society. Number 1 is understanding that your own mind is really your greatest treasure. You have more control, not total control, because we're all creatures of our environment, but you have more control over cultivating your own mind than you have over just about anything. And so it's absolutely vital to ask yourself, who am I surrounding myself with? Am I surrounding myself with people who think our society is mostly pretty good, doesn't need that much change? Am I surrounding myself with people who push me and inspire me and who hold me accountable to living my life in the best possible way, whatever that means for my own values. You have to decide what that means for your own values. But so rule number one is surround yourself with people who push you, who think, who share your values, who think differently about our society and what we're constantly being bombarded with, and who will hold you accountable for that. Number two, I mentioned this a little bit, is you have to try to expose yourself as much as possible to art and music and poetry and theater and to different stimuli, and to expand your mind, because you've seen a little bit in law school, but when you become a lawyer, you're going to get really busy, you're going to have other things going on. It's going to be very easy to just do your job, go home, watch whatever the latest show is, and then go to sleep, and then get up in the morning again and work really hard at your job. And it's the system relies on people becoming sort of like lemmings, people who don't think in really different ways about how our society could. And I think that's the beauty of a lot of the arts, right? It's about keeping our eye on what a really beautiful world could look like, even if we don't have that world right in front of us. So I think it's very, very important to stimulate your mind and expand your mind constantly with other stimuli that you're not getting at work, because if you do that, I guarantee you, you're not going to become one of the people that just accepts the daily injustices of the criminal system, because you're going to have your eye on what real human flourishing and what humans are really capable of creating. You're going to see a lot of ugliness in the criminal punishment bureaucracy, and that ugliness can rub off on you and can make you a person without much of an imagination. The third thing is it's very important to curate where you get your information. Do you get your information from standard mainstream news sources like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and institutions whose goal is to preserve American hegemony abroad and the capitalist order domestically? Or do you look at those institutions to see what standard moderate liberal people are reading, but really get your information about the world from other people with much more radical views? So who are you reading? What kind of long form stuff are you reading? What sources of news are you getting on a daily basis that are actually somewhat, at least, independent from that capitalist mentality, that neoliberal mentality, that are actually doing news and information gathering with the context of trying to radically change our society? And I guarantee you, your perspective on the world will change significantly based on what sources of information you're hearing every single day. It's why conservatives have spent so much time and money investing in something like Fox News, because how you tell people information really, really matters. It's why if you watch Democracy Now!, it's really different from if you watch the NBC Nightly News, right? And it's why if you watch certain sources of information that are much more to the left of Democracy Now!, you get a much different perspective. And so you need to expose yourself to a wide range of perspectives so that you don't become stuck to any one given perspective. For example, what Robin Kelley calls the Black radical tradition, and Robin Kelley has written a number of amazing things, Freedom Dreams, and a couple of recent great pieces in the Boston Review about all of this stuff, but you will see virtually nothing about the Black radical tradition in mainstream media. So where are you going to learn about these incredible ideas and the sort of history of this thought in critical race studies, and I could give many examples, if you don't actually go and seek it out? So that's number three. You got to curate what kind of information you put in your mind. And then number four is really just a more intangible point, which is you should always try to maintain an unrelenting curiosity about the world, even if this particular thing doesn't seem that related to your work. Maybe it's French art history or astrophysics or something, whatever it is. You should always try to be curious, because it's that sense of curiosity that I think leads you to want to and have an excitement about exploring different things. And actually, I've found that all of those things actually enrich the way that I think about the world and enrich my understanding of the world. And so I just think have a curiosity for life and never become too stagnant where you're not waking up every morning excited about some new thing that you could learn. Okay, that was a really long answer to your question, but I'm done.
So that's all we have to do. And
that's it.
All right. Okay. I think we could probably wrap up early. we are already getting sort of a handful of private questions in the chat. So it seems like there are plenty of people who are anxious to maybe ask their own questions. Is it all right to sort of open up the floor to the group and let people go ahead and ask their questions? And if people want to utilize the raise hand function, just so we don't have too many people rushing to unmute at once. And Bettina, I know that a question was sent to you if you'd like to, and I think it actually was somewhat related to something that was just touched on, if you want to start off with that.
Yeah, so I got a question in earlier, and let me just read it verbatim. There are many journalists and, quote, public intellectuals, unquote, who seem to spend much of their time defending current systems of power and the status quo, often in national newspapers and respected journals. How best can we ameliorate their effect?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, because they are a real problem. Dr. King wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail that the greatest threat that he saw was not the white citizens' councils and the Ku Klux Klan, but was in fact the white moderate. You know, the people that I think the sort of modern analog of this is the current sort of journalistic class, the consensus of contemporary journalists who, for example, were very quick to dismiss the defund the police movement because we need the police and police protect us, and what are we going to do about crime? And all of this stuff is a real effort by moderates to cut the legs out from under any movement for genuine social change. And what's so sad about this is that if we were just able to co-opt even a small percentage of the liberals and moderates into a genuine struggle for social change, we could achieve it. You know, when you look at the history and people study this, you know, you need actually a relatively small percentage of the population to be out in the streets, organized and militant, before you actually get overwhelming social change. And I think the role of the moderates is typically to align with, without using some of the grotesque language that the far right uses, but to align with the interests that want to preserve our society as much as possible. And I think the journalistic class is doing that very effectively right now. So for example, I just wrote a long piece in Current Affairs called "Why Crime Isn't the Question and Police Aren't the Answer," where I really attack the journalist class using one of its most buffoonish members, a person named Matthew Iglesias, and using some examples from some particularly bad recent coverage from the New York Times to attack the way in which moderate journalists are thinking and talking about the criminal legal system. I think there's a few different, so that was a little preface to my answer to your question. I would say the answer is different depending on who you are. If you are an academic, you bring a certain set of skills to the table, and you can write and try to get into some of these same outlets yourself, and take apart their assumptions and their empirical evidence or lack thereof, and really highlight the intellectual poverty of these positions. If you're someone like me, you can, try to use whatever tiny public platform I have now to call them out, but because I have such a minuscule platform compared to these people, they're really drowning us out. And so I think the answer for most of us is going to be organize in our communities, produce new knowledge, new truths, like the organizing that we saw, after, for example, the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor this summer. Within a matter of days and weeks, we saw people realizing things that they hadn't realized in decades. That, moments like that can really change the cultural consciousness, and no upper middle class, mostly white journalist crowd is going to be able to combat what everyone saw in the wake of George Floyd. They're going to try. But if we organize and we do deep education in groups like this, in our communities, and we follow the lead of people who are directly impacted by the system, who are telling their stories day and night, the stories of these journalists they don't ring true. Saying police prevent crime just isn't true. It doesn't make any sense. It's also the wrong question to ask. And there's so many powerful people all over the country that are demanding that we ask the right question. So how do we combat these people? I wish I had a good answer, but I think we need to just work on fortifying our own minds against their propaganda, and then using whatever platforms we may have to push back against it, and then trying to build a better platform and bigger platform by organizing the people that we have, that we're in touch with and in contact with.
Stephanie, do you want to ask your question?
I do. Thank you. So something I was thinking about as I heard you speak was talking about kind of the pillars that uphold what our current system is. And with things that have been ongoing since the recent summer and then years back and years before that as well, there's always been a lot of a discussion about reform versus abolition. And we see it a lot now, where how much can we actually change a system and reform a system before it really isn't worth reforming at that point. And when you mentioned pillars, it made me think, we can try and reform that pillar after so much time, but what if it just breaks? What if we just need to start anew? And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on a lot of the recent discussions that are coming up about whether we should stick with reform or whether we should go to abolition.
Great question. So I think, like in many important debates, people are often talking past each other in some respects in this debate. And I think there's a lot of people that have an interest in the debate being very confusing and incoherent, because when the debate is like that, then the status quo is going to prevail. And so you have a lot of, for example, a lot of moderate people, punishment bureaucrats are using words like abolition when they don't mean any such thing, and are trying to change what people mean by that term. They're changing the name of the meaning of the term defund, so that it's really incoherent and people understand really different things by that. So they can complicate this discussion about reform and abolition. So I think I would have a few reactions to your question. Number one, I think there are certain types of changes that are much more likely to lead to where we want to go toward abolition, and certain types of changes that are much more likely to preserve the status quo. I personally, when I use the word reforms, I'm referring more so to the type of reformist changes that are designed to sort of preserve the status quo. So I think, for example, I tried to get at this at the end of the first essay in the book, in the punishment bureaucracy. I think some hallmarks of those kinds of changes are changes that don't reduce the resources and size of the criminal punishment bureaucracy. Things like body cameras for the police, implicit bias training for the police. These are things the police themselves came up with. The police wanted those things. Why? Because it gives them hundreds of millions of dollars in new technology, surveillance technology that they control. They can, instead of asking, shouldn't we be videotaping the police as they go into these communities? Shouldn't we be asking the question, well, why are the police in these Black communities? What are they doing there? Instead, we're just arming them with more tools to brutalize the same people in the same neighborhood. The same is true with many of the other reforms I could talk about. The risk assessment algorithms that are all the rage now throughout the money bail system, of the use of GPS electronic monitoring, what Michelle Alexander calls the new e-carceration, Jim Crow, right? These are all reforms, right? It's better in some ways to have people on e-incarceration than in an actual cage, physical cage. An electronic cage, I guess, is superior to a physical cage. That is certainly the view of many of my clients. On the other hand, is that kind of change actually just building the infrastructure for a new kind of Jim Crow, for a new kind of surveillance and control? And I'll note for you, many of the same corporate interests that are heavily invested in the private prison industry and the prison telecom industry are now the largest owners of the GPS monitoring industry. The bail industry is shifting some of its business model. Instead of being the person that sold you the bail bond, it now wants to be the person that sells you the GPS monitor and the drug test, right? Making the same amounts of money, extracting the same wealth from the same Black and brown communities with a different storefront, different label. So there are certain reforms, and I try to outline in the first piece, whose content is designed to preserve the system. And those are generally ones that preserve the control and resources and discretion of the bureaucracy. At the same time, though, there's more of a process-related way of looking at it. The same reform can be both abolitionist or reformist, depending on how it came about. So, for example, if a particular reform was achieved by a group of directly impacted people organizing together in their community and demanding that reform, and then making sure the system gave them that reform, that actually empowers that group of people to then go on to something bigger for the next stage of their fight, now that they've become organized together. And it's in that sense like a snowball rolling down a mountain. So many directly impacted organizers around the country are not trying to abolish the system tomorrow. They're looking at incremental ways of building power and then using the power that they gather, let's say in getting a new local bail rule changed or blocking the construction of one new jail. They're using that power to then, metastasize and fight larger and larger battles going forward. At the same time, that same reform, if it's from the top down, from punishment bureaucrats who are trying to snuff out energy for real change, then actually has the opposite effect, right? So in that sense, it's analogous to firefighters. When confronted with a big wildfire, they just burn the area around the wildfire to prevent the wildfire from spreading. And in that sense, the same kind of reform could be a snowball rolling down a mountain, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or a sort of an intervention designed to block the fire of reform from spreading. And so I think it matters that you look at how a particular reform came about. Was it something that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris just wrote into the federal rules just one day without any popular support? Or was it something that was demanded by a movement of millions of people as a first step? And so that's how I think about this. We have to be constantly organizing so that the types of changes that we're getting are just one step on the road to something much more radical in nature.
Thank you. And thank you, Stephanie. That was a great question. I'm going to continue reading names of people who do have their hands raised. I just would like to apologize if I mispronounce your name and ask that you correct me so we can all pronounce one another's names correctly. But next up, I see Chloe.
Thank you. So when you were talking about your background and kind of where you are and why you have the experiences and the biases that you come to the situation with, you described a story when you were in Ferguson where you kind of held town hall meetings at people's homes and discussed the issues and talked about things and, how to establish reform and how to go about it and make the next step. And that actually reminded me a lot of Brian Stevenson's story that he wrote about in Just Mercy when he was in Alabama, and he would, go to these people's homes and their communities, and they would just all kind of air out their grievances, and he would give them kind of action plans and discuss what the next steps were. So that was in like the late 80s, early 90s, 30 plus years ago. You're describing stories that are happening, like I said, 30 plus now, 2010s, 30 plus years ago after that. At this rate, we're not going to have much change till 30, 60 years down the road. In a perfect world, where you could rebuild and demolish the system tomorrow as opposed to reform, I guess, what is the first step in doing that?
I don't know that I'm really in the best position to answer that question. As a white male lawyer, it's probably not my position to say, what strategically the movement needs to do as a first step.
I guess, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I guess as like an ally or someone who wants to support the movement and do what they can, in your opinion, what would be the first step?
Yeah, and I have had this conversation with many people organizing all over the country, so I have some sense of how I would answer it as well. I think the first step is, I think there's a few things that need to happen simultaneously. Number one, we need to be educating ourselves and our comrades about how the system really works, what interests it's serving and why it's serving those interests. And without that basic education, I think we might not have the depth of analysis that's required to really radically transform it. For example, many people who first come to these issues, I'm not talking about people who've been living them and experiencing them every day of their lives who are targeted. I'm talking about, people like me. Your first thought is the criminal system is so horrible. Let's, tweak the bail policies and have slightly lower sentences, and let's have a better police accountability so that the bad officers can be disciplined, right? These are natural good faith reactions from people who are seeing for the first time how horrible the system is. I don't think that kind of mentality will get us very far, because we have to understand that the criminal punishments bureaucracy looks the way that it looks because it's connected to injustices and inequalities in our society that go way beyond the criminal realm. So a first step is not thinking about the problem as confined to the silo of the criminal system. It's a problem that connects to healthcare, it connects to housing, it connects to mental health, it connects to environmental justice, it connects to immigration, it connects to the distribution of wealth in our society, and it connects to a failure to repair centuries of white supremacy. And so, I guess the first step is a broader education of people that the injustices that we see in front of us aren't confined to the realm of the criminal law. They are symptoms of deeper inequalities that we have to face. That's why things like universal health care would be the single best criminal justice reform, right? Because all of these systems are connected to each other. The concept of well, I'll just stop there for a second. So then the second, first step that's simultaneous is we need to come together and organize. Like the people that control our society rely on us being relatively atomized individuals who are alienated, who don't think anything is possible, who are in debt, who are controllable because we're in debt, right? Who don't have the kinds of civic and social connections to each other that a strong society has, because societies like that are much easier to control. Because everything feels daunting when you're trying to face it alone. So I think that's why what the things that excite me the most as the first steps toward really transformational change are the things that do some of this education and some of this organizing. Mutual aid networks in solidarity with the most vulnerable people in our community, whether it's trans folks or undocumented folks or people with disabilities, whatever it is. That there's some incredible mutual aid networks that are popping up, and those networks are educating people in a really real way about the intersectional nature of all of these problems. They're introducing people to each other in a way that creates bonds and forms relationships. And once you've created this kind of network, that's a powerful organized entity that can have political power as well. I am a big fan of things like worker-owned co-ops. There's a lot of talk about voting and the importance of casting a ballot every 2 years or 4 years. And so much so that if you say to someone, well, I'm not going to vote in this election, you'll be ostracized. There's an incredible stigma in liberal circles with not voting. But there's virtually no stigma in liberal circles to spending the 2 or 4 years in between votes doing very little to organize your community or build a mutual aid network or be in solidarity with Black communities, or there's no stigma, as far as I can tell, associated with just living your regular life in those 4 years. And that is boggling to me because it's actually building those networks. It's also really interesting, there's a lot of stigma associated with not voting politically, but very little stigma with not voting economically. We need to be thinking about not just democratizing our political space, but democratizing our economic spaces, our workplaces, voting to unionize, voting to take worker ownership over companies, right? Really cool things happening in some cities where instead of giving contracts to large corporations like Aramark, city governments who are the monopoly in laundry services, landscaping, janitorial services, utilities. They can give contracts to worker-owned co-ops that are set up to benefit and be owned by people who've been incarcerated or people who've been targeted by the system or other people who have been disadvantaged by their current economic reality. That's what a liberal progressive government could do. And that would actually build so much political power. Ironically, it would then lead to better voting that the liberals seem to want in the future. Another thing that's really exciting is tenant cooperatives and tenants coming together and taking ownership over their land, tenant strikes. These are all ways of these are all other versions of democracy. And so a first step is another simultaneous first step, I guess I've given you like three, is changing our conception of democracy so that it's not the solely political battlefield that Republicans and Democrats want us to be thinking about democracy, but it's a much broader economic and cultural democracy that privileges building real relationships with our fellow community members and building real economic bonds and ties to each other that actually will awaken, I think, a deeper political consciousness.
Thank you.
I do want to interject before I call on the next person, just to mention, and I don't think I'm alone in this moment, I think a lot of us have been struggling with feelings of being overwhelmed and hopeless lately. And just this discussion right now is helping to restore a lot of hope. So just wanted to throw in some gratitude for everyone here and engaging in this conversation. This is really wonderful. So Caitlin, would love for you to ask your question.
I have so many questions. Thank you so much for being here. This is amazing. So many of us at New England Law have been organizing for change in our institution and within kind of how certain marginalized groups are treated and how the curriculum is set up. There was a protest recently, and we're kind of working for change in that regard. You had mentioned earlier that part of the propaganda and part of the way we're taught is problematic, and that includes in law school. So I'm curious to know what you see as a better way to train future movement lawyers and to train anyone who is going to be touching the criminal injustice system right from the beginning as a 1L.
Such a good question. Let me just, given that you said that, let me reiterate what I said before. It's just so important that you find comrades that you can do that work with, Caitlin, because it can be very difficult and very lonely. Most law schools are designed to churn out corporate lawyers and have a very particular way of conceptualizing legal doctrine that really erases so much of the human stories that are often trampled by that doctrine. And it can be really disconcerting and almost like the entire curriculum is like a form of gaslighting. And so what do you do in a situation like that? You have to find other people who you can turn to and say, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's not me, like I'm not the crazy person here, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? You can't talk about this law without talking about race, right? So like a very preliminary step is like, finding those people and then trying to slowly expand how large that group is, because that's going to be the way you can get through it. I think in terms of like the 1L curriculum, you have to demand that there be some version of the curriculum that is a critical examination of the law. Someone who teaches critical race studies, someone who understands and comes from like a Marxist perspective. It's okay to have one person like that on your faculty. People need to be exposed to that idea, and they need to be able to explore it if they're interested in it. And so I think, as an initial demand, you should be demanding that the 1Ls get exposed to things, to ideas like that, and and there should be some method of introducing people to these ideas. So I don't know beyond that what's helpful advice, but just to say that there has to be a space for critical legal studies and critical analysis of the law. And maybe like sort of abolition of the criminal system is a way into that now, because I think a lot of law schools are feeling a lot of pressure in the wake of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths, for example. I'm just using those two people because they're the most widely in the popular consciousness. Obviously, there are many, many human beings brutalized and murdered every single day by the punishment bureaucracy. I'm not meaning to privilege those two stories over any others. But in the wake of this movement, a lot of law schools feel like they have to do something. And so you might as well make that thing not a token, but a really meaningful thing.
Thank you. So
And
I'm going
may
to,
I just ask a quick follow-up? Okay. So as you go through your legal education and you are kind of coming into the realization that you want to do movement lawyering work, what advice do you have to law students who are trying to navigate how to do that?
In addition to the sort of 4 things that I mentioned earlier, which advice I would give to everyone really, for law students, I think, you know, in addition also to like finding your comrades, it's like thinking about what job can I get that will allow me to be a movement lawyer. And I think increasingly that can be true of public defenders' offices. But also, you know, one thing a lot of law schools don't really teach people is that they can start their own practice and they can form a collective with other people. Especially at relatively fancy law schools, you're you know, in this rat race for law firms, and then if not that, then for very particular nonprofit jobs. When in fact, most students at many schools around the country are just hanging their own shingle. And you can make a tremendous living. For example, just take Boston, where I used to be a student and work in the local criminal court. Most of the lawyers taking cases are private lawyers getting paid hourly, and they make a tremendous amount of money. In DC, where I live, they cap your payment at $150,000 a year from court-appointed cases, but your practice can also include civil cases. And so instead of these law schools like spending money on and recruiting, you know, for law firms, what if they supported you all by giving you office space and Westlaw access, and then each year 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 of you started a collective, and you did immigration cases and criminal cases and got court-appointed cases, and you did police cases and wage and hour cases and environmental regulations cases and disability cases. You can actually make a lot of money. And people who are way less committed than you are doing it right now in Boston. People who don't care about their clients and don't put the time in, right? I've seen it, and I've seen it in every city. I just found a lawyer who's not visited any of their clients in years in Houston, who makes $350,000 or $400,000 a year on court-appointed cases alone. It's doable. You're just not really set up to think about it. And once a group of you form a collective and do that 1 year, you now have all kind of knowledge for the next people, and you can share your motions with them. You can share the business, you know, stuff you learned from them. You can share office space. You can give referrals. And after 2 or 3 years of this, you've got a group of 15, 20, 25 people who think of themselves as movement lawyers in Boston. You've totally changed the legal landscape in a small town like that, right? So like, you know, I would think it would take a little bit more in a place like New York or Los Angeles, right? But like in a place like Boston, like 25 lawyers who are changing the way we think about criminal stuff and civil rights and connection to disability law and environmental stuff and wage and hours, like that's a huge change to the local legal landscape. And it's scary because of all the debt that you're all under, and there's all kinds of barriers. So I'm not saying you have to do it, but it's one thing to think about. And even if you don't do it right away, maybe you take a job as a public defender for a couple of years, you'll get some understanding of how the system works and some connections, and then you can start doing that, right? And maybe you guys can organize for your law school to help support that kind of endeavor with some of its free office space or whatever. So mean, I think it's just think differently about your legal career. There's a great lawyer in Boston who I'll shout out, named Oren Nimni. Oren, it would be the perfect person to talk to about this. I see some of you nodding your heads. But he's been there and done this exact thing in Boston, and is just an incredible advocate and movement lawyer.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Caitlin, for those questions. Tiffany, if you'd like to go next, and then Bettina, I know you had a couple questions thrown your way as well.
Hi, Alec. Good seeing you again.
Hey,
I have to be honest. The first time I heard you speak at UCLA, and you mentioned public defender complicity, I immediately was defensive, and it was sort of, you know, as almost an 18-year veteran of the public defender's office, I kind of respond like, what does this kid know, right? Like, you practiced as a PD for a couple years, and now you have a lot to say about how we do our business. But since that day, 3 or 4 years ago, I sort of have come to a different place where, you know, I read your book, I read your articles, and I'm like, damn it, he's right? There's something about public defender work that can feel very complicit. And I also kind of looked at my entire career and sort of had this reckoning with the moments where I didn't push back when I had a pregnant client who was shackled, right? But then now that I'm in leadership in our office, I sort of look at the externs, and we have these very difficult conversations, thanks to you in large part. And they're bright, they're abolitionists, they're energetic. How do they keep that same energy? I started being thoughtful about, can this last? Is there some period in which in your career where the energy that you put into each case has to be preserved, where you're doing public defender triage, right? Like, I'll tell you a quick story about a case I had recently where I wrote a 20-page bail motion. My client facing life in prison. And I filed this 20-page motion, and the judge is about to call it. The DA says, Your Honor, I need time to respond. The judge says, don't bother, right? She didn't even have to do anything. How do you file that motion in every case if you're a public defender? How do you, with limited time and limited resources and limited energy, how do you put all of that into every single case over the course of your career? Practically, is that even possible?
First of all, it's great to see you again. Looking forward to connecting again afterward. I have a couple of responses. Number one, I think some of the stuff that I've watched you from afar a little bit these last couple of years, and some of the organizing that you've done of your colleagues. You know, particularly when you were when your office. Well, I don't want to get into too many of the details, but just like, you know, they tried to put someone to run your office who you know wasn't aligned with the core mission, right? And at least as far as I could tell from being an outsider, you were, you know, a huge factor in organizing your colleagues to fight that. And that's the kind of thing that I see public defenders as having enormous potential to do that we really haven't done very much of. There's an incredible organization of public defenders over the last 2 months in New Orleans. They organized something called Flip the Bench, and they had a couple of public defender colleagues actually unseat 2 of the worst judges in New Orleans. And, you know, 2 Black women public defenders are now going to be judged in New Orleans. And, you know, the same thing happened a little bit in Houston, where 17 Black women came together and ran on a slate of judges and all won in 2018. And that is like a product of like public defenders gaining a new sense of like politics and like organizing. The reason I think this is relevant to your question is I think we're always going to struggle with the questions like the one you asked me if we think about it in terms of a solo public defender. Like, how can this solo public defender possibly represent this many clients and fight this hard in every case? Not just without burning out, but just, I mean, like physically. Like, how would you write a 20-page bail motion for every client? I mean, So I think the answer has to be coming together with other colleagues and organizing to challenge the systems that are putting you in that position. And one of the things that we've done in Santa Clara and in San Francisco is we actually paid for a fellow in Santa Clara on the condition that the county pay for another lawyer, a social worker, and an investigator. And they created a pretrial bail unit. And it's now that unit's responsibility to do all of that work for the individual lawyers and prepare you for that hearing with investigation, with social work. So you can walk into court and say to the judge, here's an entire plan that's already worked out. We also partnered with Silicon Valley Debug, who you know, to get organizers at every bail hearing. And so at every bail hearing, organizers are meeting with people's families. And then now that after not only can they relay information about where the person's going to stay and what the family's role is to the judge, but now after that hearing, the family now comes over to Silicon Valley Debug and they meet other families of other people who are going through the system. And now all of a sudden you've got a network of families that are organized with sort of through this relationship with the public defender and the local organizers. Like that's the kind of thing that traditionally public defenders would have not seen as part of their job. But when you put it all together, it not only helps you get through the work because you're building connections in your community and you're feeling a part of something bigger, but it also actually helps you get your job done because now you have all of these other people that are helping prepare sentencing videos for your client and that are invested in the case and that are packing the courtroom. And so I think the short, broad answer to your question is like, don't think about it as what can individual public defenders do, but what can organized groups of public defenders do to change the conditions under which individual public defenders are laboring. And it's not a panacea. The system is so messed up and it's not going to fix all of the problems. But I think now that you're in leadership, which I think is probably a reflection of the power that you built up through that organizing, you can sort of shape the office with people who maybe think more systemically and more about organized power than people who think about just coming in and litigating a few cases because they like to be in court.
Thank you.
Let's connect later too. I'm looking forward to getting back in touch.
For sure.
Bettina, I don't know if you want to read any of the questions that were sent your way.
Yeah, sure. So the first question I have, so what is your response to people asking, what is the alternative to jails and prisons? It might go to your statement about white liberals being unsure about defunding the police.
So I have different responses to this question on different days of the week. What is it, Thursday? I'll give my Thursday response. I think like the desire to ask that question always amuses me because nobody ever really asked that question before they started caging everyone, right? Like, if you could just say to someone, do you remember what this country looked like in 1980? Or have you ever been to any other country in the world? Like that right there is what 80% fewer cops in prisons would look like. Does it look that different to you? Like, did America look that different in 1980, such that it's so scary that we could never go back to it in a million years? The sky will fall if we look like Canada. So I think, like, first of all, we can agree that like we could agree on 80% of the reduction in the criminal system without even like getting to any of the hard questions. 96% of all police time is things that the police themselves say are nonviolent, right? And yet the story that police give us, before we even get to critiquing that story, the story they give us for why they exist is violent crime, to protect us from violent crime, from predators, right? This is the kind of words that they use. And yet the vast bulk of what they do has nothing to do with that. And there's no evidence that it does. So I always think it's really amusing to people. It's like, would it be that bad to go back to 2010? What about 2005? What about 2000? What about 97? Was it unlivable in 97, right? And then, some people will push back and say, well, yes, we had, horrific crime wave in the 90s and things were unbearable. And I say, well, Do you know, for example, whether more people were killed from alcohol in 1997 than all violent crime combined? No, I didn't know that. Did you know that more people died from air pollution than all violent crime combined in 97? Did you know that way more people die from cigarettes and tobacco every single year than all violent crime? The reason you're focused on violent crime is political. It's because violent crime gives you a tool to control and oppress certain groups of our population. You can't do that with tobacco. You can't do that with environmental pollution. In fact, it's the opposite with environmental pollution. If we were serious about solving environmental pollution, it would actually help all of the people that are marginalized in our communities that have been forced to live near sources of pollution and waste. So by any measure, violent crime has never been a significant cause of illness or death when you compare it to things like car accidents or texting while driving or cigarette smoking or lack of access to healthcare. And so our privileging of that, and we don't have any evidence, by the way, that caging people for committing those violent crimes, let's say, actually leads to a world with less violent crime. I was recently debating the chief of police in Houston on a podcast, and he started shouting at me that I didn't care about communities and that we have the most violent society in world history right now, and so we need more and more cops. And I said to him, for the last 40 years, you spent trillions of dollars on cops and weapons and grenades and guns and jails and prisons and cages and courts and prosecutors and public defenders, and you've invaded other countries and you've carpet bombed Latin America to destroy drug fields and kill rainforests, and you've surveilled the whole world. You've captured tens of millions of communications, and you've separated tens of millions of children from their parents, and we still have the most violent society in world history. Does that tell you something about the methods that you've been using and whether they may be or not be effective? You know, like, these people don't even understand the incoherence in their own positions. And that's because the reasons that they're giving us are not the actual reasons that they're doing the things that they're doing. So now, what are the alternatives? I mean, I already listed some of them. I mean, I think one, but the first thing I'll say is just stop doing most of what we're doing. We don't even need an alternative. You just don't need to arrest people for possessing a plant. You just don't need to arrest people for driving on a suspended license, right? You don't need to arrest people for trespassing when they don't have a home. You don't need to arrest people for you know, things caused by mental illness. Like, we could just, there's so much low-hanging fruit that cover the majority of police arrests. And then in terms of alternatives, I mean, there's incredible new work being done in restorative justice, in worker-owned co-ops, in theater and music and art programs for children that really intervene in cycles of you know, poverty and jail and detention. It depends on the kind of problem you're trying to solve. I think the intervention with gender-based violence is attacking the culture of toxic masculinity. The intervention in you know, crimes related to homelessness is getting people safe places to live. In neither case is the intervention caging the people who commit those crimes. So I think it really depends, but there are incredible alternatives in all of these realms. There are programs that where directly impacted people lead sort of restorative programs in toxic masculinity. There are programs around the country where people who've been formerly incarcerated get to own and run their own businesses. There are programs around the country where people who've been harmed by someone can sit around and demand accountability from that person without caging the person. All of this exists. We kind of know what they are. And then I just think finally, like, we need to invest in people's health and wellness. If people were getting the treatment and the care that they need, much of what's currently dealt with in the criminal system, which is now the largest mental health provider in most major cities around the country, much of that would just go away. So those are some of my answers. I think it's an exciting topic of conversation precisely because the current system doesn't want to have it. That's why police in Baltimore recently targeted the violence interrupters. I don't know if you all read that article, but local community members were doing violence interruption, and they were having a tremendous success in reducing violence in very small neighborhoods in Baltimore. And instead of celebrating this, the police started trying to arrest the violence interrupters and target them because they saw it as competition. And I think we have to get away from from the power that contemporary police forces hold over our conception of what an alternative to their sort of monopoly on the use of force and violence could look like.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you have a question?
Yes, yeah. So I have a couple of questions here. Hopefully, I can kind of get this out in a somewhat related way. But my first question is do you think that any aspects, if any, of the modern law enforcement system, and I'm thinking specifically of local police departments, should be incorporated in an ideal criminal justice system? And then secondly, and this was kind of in response to your last answer to the last question, is if we did in fact, stop arresting people for acts that currently our society considers as crimes, such as homelessness, failure to pay debt, as you mentioned in stories earlier, how would you recommend with dealing with actual violent crimes such as assaults and murders?
Let me say first that I think when people talk about abolition, they're not talking about a world that looks just like our world, then suddenly removing all the jails and prisons and police. They're talking about a world that looks so different, we don't really need those things anymore. And I really do believe that much of what is called violent crime wouldn't exist in a world where there wasn't so much inequality, deprivation, and trauma. I think those cycles of poverty and trauma and abuse and neglect lead to the things that we call violent crime. Just take one example, there's incredible, robust research about how exposure of children to lead actually leads to future arrests for what are called violent crime. And obviously, as you know, the people who live in the poorest communities in our country are exposed to incredibly high quantities of lead. That's just one tiny example. It's a physical sort of example, but the same is really true of, and it's why so many people who are wealthy spend so much money to give their children everything that they need when they're growing up. Guitar lessons and cello lessons and basketball teams and field hockey teams and whatever it is at all these prep schools, right? Music and vocal lessons and like theater classes and pottery classes and tutors and whatever it is. Like, everyone understands that when you invest that much in every human being, you try to create as much as possible. One of the reasons that a lot of white people, choose where to live is some notion they have of their children will experience less trauma if they move to certain neighborhoods. Forgetting about all of the problematic assumptions and notions that are wrapped up in that, there's a basic truth that everyone understands, which is that if you expose people to trauma, it hurts them. And if you expose many millions of people to certain types of trauma, it leads to a society where people are constantly inflicting trauma and harm on each other. And so we need to figure out a way of breaking those cycles of harm. And if we do that, I think we'll see a lot less of what's currently called violent crime. Secondly, I hinted at this earlier, but a lot of violence in our society, in my opinion, is based on toxic masculinity. And so there's an incredible documentary on CNN.com that you can watch for free called The Feminist on Cell Block Y, which is where a friend of mine named Richie, when he was in prison in California, developed this program where he organized for years to get this, and he had all of these guys in these reading groups, so they would read bell hooks and other radical feminists and sort of work on combating toxic masculinity. And then when people get out, when you go through the program, the next year you then facilitate the program. Then when you get out of prison, now that Richie is out, he hires them to do this program in other places all around. And like, these programs have a tremendous impact in confronting some of the strands of our culture that actually lead to a lot of the violence. So I'm just giving little examples. None of the things I'm saying are like the overall solution. I'm just trying to hint at what kinds of things we might think about if we wanted to solve problems like violence. Then I'll just say, I just have never seen any evidence that police and jail and solitary confinement and cages and the way we think about punishment, most of those people who we punish are then coming back into our communities. And I've never seen any evidence that inflicting that kind of cruelty on someone, sending them to a place where they have a significant chance of being sexually and physically assaulted, where they can't get exercise and fresh air, and where any of that kind of thing actually leads to them to commit fewer crimes in the future. And in fact, the countries that have prison systems that don't do that actually have way lower recidivism rates than this country. So, I think we can get rid of, 98 or 99% of what is currently called violent crime just by doing these kinds of interventions. Now, some police and sheriffs that I've debated with will say, well, there's just some percentage of the population that are sociopaths, and they're predators. They're going to try to harm other people, no matter what you do. And I said, well, I actually, I'll grant you that. Having been both a public defender and on the Harvard Law Review, I can tell you that I met way more sociopaths on the Harvard Law Review than I ever met as a public defender. Those sociopaths have learned other ways of harming people, ways that are more consistent with your conception of crime. And so, I think it's about creating social institutions that minimize the chances for people to harm people and direct harm into channels that are more easily detectable and addressable. Whether in an ideal world we'll need some kind of collective force that can respond to emergencies, I think is probably true. Do we need anything that looks close to like what our police or prisons or jails look like? I don't see that. But again, you don't have to agree with me on that radical view to agree that we should get rid of 80% of the system right now, and then see what we can do with those resources to help invest in the kinds of things that make it even further obsolete.
Thank you so much for that response. I know that's a point that gets raised often, and it's great to be able to think about it through that lens. I noticed that Professor Goulden has her hand raised, so I'd love to give you an opportunity, and just to make sure we're all on the same page. I think we are ending in about 10 minutes, and certainly want to respect your time, Alec, for being here. So I do think Bettina has maybe a couple questions. We'll see if we can squeeze them in, but go ahead, Professor Goulden.
Yeah, I just was going to raise two quick questions, and thank you again. It's really been great to be part of this. I appreciate you guys making room for our students. And Alec, we've read your book for our criminal justice reform seminar, and actually had Steve DeMuth, who worked with you worked with your team on the Harris County case, come and talk with class last week. So I was going to follow up on that and just ask you sort of, how do you deal with data challenges in the different cases that you're dealing with? And I thought my students might like to sort of hear your perspective on dealing with expert witnesses or finding partners in the community to help you gather and interpret the data that you need for some of this litigation. And so I'll just confine it to that question, actually.
Okay. I'm really sorry about all this sun. I came up to a place where I could get internet here, and I just can't find a spot that doesn't have all the sun in it. Hope it's not coming through too choppy for you. Such a good question. And Steve is sort of our hero. It was my first big case like that, big bail case. We were actually going to go to trial, and I was going to use our recent college graduate paralegal investigator as our witness to do all the data stuff. And she kept telling me, I really don't think this is a good idea. I'm like, oh, it's fine, And then there was a moment when me and the other lawyer doing the case were like, oh boy, we're really in trouble here. I don't think, we really have to get an expert. And so it was 3 or 4 days before the expert reports were due, and someone connected me to Steve, and he was just like a godsend. He agreed we didn't have much money. He agreed to do the case pro bono, and he pulled 2 all-nighters in a row for free, pro bono, and produced like an incredible expert report. And then in the next month or two before trial, he put in like 240 hours for our case, all pro bono, producing report after report. And the other side paid $100 and some thousand for this ridiculous expert, and Steve just tore him apart. The judge was so enamored with Steve, and I just never forget the look on her face when she asked him, are you getting compensated for this? And he said no, and she just like her glasses dropped, and or someone asked him, what is your compensation? He's like, oh, I'm just doing it pro bono. Like her glasses dropped. I mean, nobody could believe it, because like no one is used to expert witnesses doing things out of passion and commitment to the cause. And since then, Steve has done all of his work for us pro bono, and is just such an incredible asset. And if you can find an expert like Steve, it makes everything easier. But I think I was torn, because I think on the one hand, there's an urge by a lot of reformers and courts looking at the criminal system to collect data and use data and have data-driven solutions. And to me, it's like, that stuff is all very silly. No one ever required data before we constructed this thing. We all know that it's racially disproportionate. Do we need to know that it's 78% disproportionate versus 76.9%, right? We all know that it's targeting the poor. We all know the money bail system doesn't do any good. We all know that it's unfair, it's illegal. The legal claims are very clear. Like, by introducing all of this data, does it actually play into our opponents in some respect? Does it actually take on a higher burden that somehow we need to prove the injustice of the money bail system using data? And so I was really torn, but what we've been able to do the last few years is use data as a supplement, as another part of the story for people who are moved by that kind of thing in particular, not to replace the arguments we're making or the stories that we're telling, but to enhance them and to add rigor to them in the minds of people who care about those kinds of things. And I think it's been very effective. And so one of the important stories about the criminal punishment bureaucracy is that it cared so little for whether it was achieving its aim that it never bothered to collect much data on whether it was successful. That's very telling, right? And so, I think it can be helpful in certain limited ways to quantify the scope of the, it can be important to say, there are 500,000 human beings caged pre-trial, It can be important to say 40% of all driver's licenses suspended because they owe debt. And so Steve, in his work in that case and in many other cases, including our Ferguson case, is helping us in the same way like a good data journalist would help us, right? Culling through the data and picking out like very discrete ways in which we can tell a very powerful story. And so I hope that's helpful, and I'd be happy to talk more with you about it in the future. But expert witnesses haven't been a huge part of our work for some of the strategic reasons I've mentioned, but people like Steve have been indispensable in certain key moments. And I think we could not have won the Harris County case or produced the kind of rigorous opinion that we got without Steve. Even since we only have 4 minutes, can I just say one thing, Bree? I'm so glad that many of you read the book and like it. I wanted to highlight a couple of things. First, none of the royalties for the book go to me. All of the royalties go to an amazing organization called the SE Justice Group. It's ESSIE. It's an organization that organizes women with incarcerated loved ones to build a powerful community to take on the system of maximum caging, and was founded by a dear friend of mine named Gina Clayton Johnson. So if you like the book, buy one for a loved one or a friend, and encourage other people to read it. And all the royalties are going to a great cause. And then also for those of you who are professors or who know professors, we have a charitable fund set up for the book so that if you assign the book in your class, all the students can get it for free. And we'll send a matching copy to someone in prison for every student who gets it. So we're really trying to spread the ideas in the book. And if for those of you who like the book and like the discussion today, it'd be really wonderful if you could make a point to spread the word about the book and have it assigned in other classes. And I'm always happy to come talk to classes or law schools or other groups of people. So I just wanted to make sure I said that before we ended.
Well, that is actually one of the last questions we had received was Nick Bakis asked, how can we help and how can we get involved? And even if it's just for, you know, those of us who are heading off to big law, where can they send their money? So I don't know if you have any other recommendations or how to help support your work.
I have lots of recommendations. We only have a couple of minutes. So, I mean, I think it's really important to find the local abolitionist groups in your area and to support them. I think the big national nonprofits have a ton of support coming their way. And a lot of the people that are doing like really great local grassroots organizing are indispensable. I've been working with incredible groups all over the country. Some of the most inspiring ones recently are the coalition of organizations in the Justice LA Coalition. They stopped the construction of $1 billion new jail, passed a measure called Measure J on the most recent election that they wrote and developed, which is going to steer hundreds of millions of dollars away from the criminal system toward community-based alternatives like health and wellness. They're doing incredible stuff. Patrice Cullors is sort of involved in a lot of those organizations, and you know, there's incredible organizations doing that work in Los Angeles Community Action Network, Dignity and Power Now. Tiffany probably has other ideas, but I'm super excited about what's going on in Los Angeles right now. So if you're at a loss and can't find a local abolitionist set of organizing and you want to donate to this, there's incredible energy in Los Angeles right now. But in general, really grateful. Spread the word to other people who teach criminal law that we're available to come talk to them. We can get the book in the hands of their students. I can recommend people who are directly impacted by these systems to come speak to their classes and offer a different perspective than what their students may be getting. And so just be in touch if you want to be talking about any of those things.
Well, thank you so much for your time, for your passion, for all of the work that you do, for sharing this time and this space with us here today. Thank you everyone for being here and for joining the discussion. We did just open the chat back up in case anyone has their own local organizations they want to drop in the chat to help other people look into. I just dropped a few local abolitionist organizations from around Boston if anyone wants to check them out and support them in their work. And feel free to pop any words of thanks to Alec in the chat. And we cannot thank you enough for this. This was very needed, very cathartic. I've learned so much in the past 2 hours, and we're very grateful for the work you do and for joining us here today. And thank you, everyone. We had such a great attendance tonight, which I think is reflective of how invested people are in doing this work and in not just imagining, but creating a better world. So thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Alex, so much. This was really wonderful and inspiring, and we appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.